your lives?
Well, I mean, what we have is that we're going to face an epidemic, and this epidemic, following in this war, involves 300,000 to 400,000 soldiers and Marines and other servicemen at a minimum. It's an epidemic where these young men and women who have served, in many cases multiple times, in Iraq and Afghanistan, have been exposed to multiple IED blasts. And these blasts, which are high-pressured concussive waves, as well as direct where fragments of material have hit them, and they've hit their heads, cause concussions and injuries to their brains. And this happens many, many times in the course of a deployment. For the Army soldiers, a year; for the Marines, 7 months. And if they've been there 2, 3, 4 times, they could have had dozens of these concussions. Over time, these injuries really impair their functioning as well as their whole mental state. And we've got any number of these soldiers and Marines who complain of problems that really limit their ability to just carry on their lives. They've got problems with their memory, they've got headaches, they've got lots of aches and pains, they can't pay attention, their mood is really depressed, they feel anxious, and they find that they're just not the same person. I don't know how many times I've heard the story from these young folks. I'm just not the same person who went over, and I don't know what happened. Well, one of the things that happened was that they suffered the effects of the IED blasts. They also, in the course of a year, were in combat. They were in lots of patrols. They saw their buddies injured, many times, unfortunately, a number of them killed. They themselves had their lives threatened. They're exposed to all sorts of toxins. I mean, war really is a significant, has a big impact on people, and lots of times the impact it has, we don't know what it's going to be before we decide to get into the fight. I mean, it happened in Vietnam. We came out of it with what we call the post-Vietnam syndrome, PTSD, big problem with Agent Orange, and now here we are 25, 35 years later, and we're really beginning to see what the problems are with Agent Orange. What's going to be like 25, 35 years from now when these young men and women, hundreds of thousands of them, are trying to lead their lives, and they find out that they're suffering the effects of the combat that they, in fact, helped, they were involved in. Not the first time we've had this following a war. The fact that we get a public health epidemic follows our involvement with wars pretty commonly. Like I said, Vietnam and the Agent Orange, World War II, 20% of the soldiers who fought in World War II had psychiatric problems. They all hit them. We didn't find out about them for a long time afterwards. Probably contributed to any number of cases of alcoholism, as well as other problems in living for these young folks. After World War I, big problem with shell shock. It's called shell shock, neurasthenia. Was it the fact that these soldiers in Europe, again, millions of them, were victimized by all the artillery shells? Was it just the harsh conditions? It's one of those things that never got figured out, except that hundreds of thousands of these men suffered for a long, long time afterwards, found themselves homeless, jobless. Of course, their circumstances were worsened because of the Great Depression. So what's going to happen to these young men? They've got the effects of these concussions, and not only that, they're coming back home. They're facing a real tough economy. The unemployment rate amongst veterans is about 16-17%. when you compare it to the unemployment rate of the general population, which is about 8-9%. Lots of them don't know. I mean, they've served so many years. They're trying to get skills, but in fact, they're finding it hard to go to school. They're finding it hard to learn new jobs, and lots of them are suffering from the effects of these concussions. Over the years, and I started working in this in 2004, I spent a good deal of time at Walter Reed and saw a number of soldiers who had the first wave that had come back, and in just talking to them realized they weren't the same. They were having problems. I tried to alert the leadership of the Army Medical Department that we were going to face a new syndrome, a syndrome we had not seen before. If you look at these young men who had lost their legs and arms to IED blasts, the natural question is, so if the blast was so bad that it blew off their legs, what happened to their heads? Would it have had an effect with their heads? We all know that if you get a concussion playing ball, you don't feel right for some time afterwards. And if you've got a number of them, in fact, like boxers do, you might be permanently damaged. So these young men who are now had amputations because of these blasts are probably suffering the effects. Their brains are also suffering the effects. Well, in 2004, there wasn't a whole lot of interest in it. And I kept pushing for a way of being able to identify what the extent of injury was and who was injured. There are some tests we needed to use. I was particularly interested in quantitative EEG, the brainwave test, because it's objective. And you need an objective test. And also one that might help you tell the difference between the psychological problems and the health problems from what the emotional effects are to what the physical damage is. I found that I had to go directly to the senior leadership of the Army to even get an audience about testing it. And then I learned about some other possible treatments, like hyperbaric oxygen. There was a great worry about its safety. We know that, in fact, if administered with under protocol, it can be extremely safe. But there wasn't a lot of interest in even trying a new treatment, and even figuring out really quickly if it was going to have a benefit and who it was going to help. I believe that you have to approach this problem with finding the right treatment for the right patient at the right time. We're going to stop. Okay.